Okay, welcome to class, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the rise of the book. So you're going to see this progression here on this slide from oral communication all the way over to digital communication. You're going to see this a couple of times throughout the lectures because I'm going to tell you the story of human communication as it starts with oral communication. It goes all the way down to where we are today, which is digital communication, and will probably keep going to something beyond digital communication. Think implanted devices inside of our bodies or our brains that can read our thoughts and communicate simultaneously with other people. I don't know, it's fun to imagine what might come after digital communication, but right now we're going to start all the way back in oral communication, which is where human communication started. So in oral tradition, ancient people would sit around, the campfire is the way I like to imagine it, and they would tell stories. So they would have stories and songs that they would memorize that told the story and the rules of their tribe. So you might think of Grimm's fairy tales today, which we're still using stories all the time to teach lessons, to teach morals, to teach kids and adults what's right and what's wrong, what's normal, what's not so normal, what's admirable, and what is looked down upon. Stories teach us that. And people used to sit around the campfire and tell stories, and the tribe would have its traditional stories that would be memorized and retold and retold. So if you think about the fairy tales, you've got the story of Hansel and Gretel, for example, of the two kids that go out in the woods, and then what happens to them? They get caught by an evil old lady who tries to eat them. And so, what is the lesson in this story? What might it teach little children if you tell them a story like that? Well, it might teach them to be really careful when they go out in the woods, not to get lost in the woods like Hansel and Gretel did, because they left a little path with breadcrumbs, and then somebody came and ate up all the breadcrumbs and they couldn't get home. So you have to be very careful in the woods, never get lost in the woods, because you might get eaten up by somebody. And so this was like a way to keep children safe back in the day. My mother was taught to be terrified of water because her parents, were busy trying to survive. So her mom would be inside cooking and cleaning, and you would tell the kids, stay outside. And because you weren't watching them all day long, you would teach them to be afraid of things that could hurt them. So they would tell you scary stories about, the swamp monster that lived in the lake that would get you if you went into the water, to try and keep kids from drowning. So we still tell stories all the time, of course, to teach things, and we learn what's normal and what's good, what's bad, what's weird, what happens, when you make certain life choices. If you decide to do a lot of drugs, there are lots of movies today that tell you the story of people who do a lot of drugs and what happens then. Or stories about murder mysteries. And so we still are learning all kinds of things about each other and about life through stories. But back in the oral tradition, we would have almost professional storytellers. You'd have people that were just excellent at storytelling. And as you can imagine, without even books yet, let alone movies or TV, people were pretty bored. So storytellers were really good at telling stories. So you could sit around and listen to stories, and these people would, almost act them out. And you would have music where people were really good at discourse and people were really good at presenting information. And if you think about it, if I'm going to just write everything that I'm saying, if I just write it down, then you're not getting my facial expressions, you're not getting my inflection, you're not with me. So you're already missing a little something in our communication because we're not physically together, because I'm not able to read your facial expressions, right? I'm not able to read whether you're confused, whether you're bored, whether you're interested, whether you're looking at your phone right now instead of really focusing. I'm not able to get feedback from you. And so some thinkers, as we were moving into a written tradition, thought that writing down our stories or writing down our important ideas actually flatten the communication by taking out all the nonverbals. Of course, what do we do now when we're texting to make our communication more dynamic? We recognize that a lot of things get lost in translation when we're texting people. So we've added the emoji, right? These little stickers that say, oh, I'm just kidding around, or I'm just joking. If you ever text with somebody that doesn't use any emojis or any smiley faces or exclamation points, you might think that they're upset with you, right? Or they're being passive aggressive or something is strange. So these emojis help soften our communication, help get across what we mean when we need to flatten our communication through written language. So we start with oral tradition, and it relies on poets and storytellers memorizing the stories and retelling them to communicate the knowledge of the tribe. And what we usually do in class is we do the telephone game, which you've probably played before, and I'll say something goofy like, I have tickets to the Super Bowl and I plan to take my dog, which I literally did in class yesterday. And then the front row of the class sends that story down the line, and literally there were only about 10 students in that front row. And by the end, the last student said something like, I want to go swimming in the pool this weekend. I mean, it got totally miscommunicated along the line. Somebody messed it up. And as you might imagine, with oral tradition, it's just not extremely reliable as far as keeping a record of our stories, right? Of what's happened to us as a people group. So if you look at the story of the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible originally was passed down through oral tradition and eventually gets written down. So the origin stories of Adam and Eve, right, are thought to have been told generation through generation through generation. The story, the origin stories especially, were started with oral tradition and eventually written down. So here is the oral communication to written communication transition, sort of put into bullet points for you. So poets and teachers and storytellers become the primary mode of distribution in the oral tradition. And then we move into around 1000 BC, but of course we get hieroglyphics in Egypt long before that, but probably when writing started to become more normal was more around the year 1000 BCE. And we figure out how to represent our sounds using symbols. So if I want to say cat, then I represent each sound with a symbol, C-A-T, cat. And so just to form an alphabet was extremely new and important technology. So if information is passed through oral tradition and we've got talented storytellers and poets who are communicating that, you have smaller communities because our community is formed around our news and information and rules and stories. And that information can only travel as far as my voice can travel. So if I want to send a message, I may have to ride an animal or walk or run and then orally present that message. So we don't even have a mail system where we're able to write down letters. So with written communication, we start to see larger and larger tribes and groups of people because now we can be organized and we can stay up to date, we can stay connected through letters. But when written communication starts, there is inequality of power as far as who has access to that written technology. So as you see here through the bullet points, philosophers and monks and stenographers can document and transcribe. So only certain people are educated. Only certain people are literate. Only certain people can actually document and transcribe things, let alone read things. And so if your small nation state or communities, so nation states are emerging along with written communication, or your community is organized around these written documents, like the Bible, for example, then that document is very powerful because it tells us the rules for how to behave. And if I can't read and nobody who I know can read, then that leaves the power to translate and teach the rules to the people that can read, which was either the religious elite or the rich people or the highly educated people. So really it favored the rich and the religious. And it created this gap between the literate elite and the illiterate working class. And so we have an imbalance of power, which is remedied in part by education. And we see, to where we are today, where there's public education, where it's not common anymore to be illiterate, because people can learn lots more than just how to read for free, in this country, for example. So here's an example of a hand-transcribed book. So just like we talked about, there's an inequality of power in this period because most people are not literate. They can't read or write. Most people cannot own a book. So a book like this that was handwritten, painstakingly handwritten, and of course if you made a mistake, you'd have to start over and paper is very expensive at that time. People who can write are expensive to hire at that time. So books were extremely expensive, and only the rich or special people owned a book. Then we start to see the beginning of modern print. This is an example of stamping technology. Over 5,000 years ago, this is found in ancient Sumerian culture, and what it was probably used for is like a seal or a signature for an official, a leader or a ruler, an official, to sign a document saying, yes, I sign off on this. They would roll their stamp. Then we've got block printing, which starts in China around the year 200. And this is where we figure out we can use stamps in an organized way in order to write books even. And then we move into movable type in the year 1000, right? Hundreds of years later, it's really movable type in China is the early printing press, which comes in the 1400s in Europe. But movable type in China is you're able to pick characters or words and arrange them on a template, and then you can stamp a piece of paper on top of the arranged characters and words. And then you can stamp lots of pages, lots of pieces of paper, and create a book faster and create more copies of that book. So it's slowly leading us to the place where we are now, where books are inexpensive and you can own lots of books, and most people do own lots of books. So this is a YouTube video that you may want to watch more of if you have time. I'll show you a short clip right now.
These molds will then be polished so that the characters can be written on and engraved easily.
So you can see they're creating stamps of characters so that they can more quickly reproduce letters and documents.
And engraving. In movable type of printing, character writing and engraving is not an easy job. First, one should use a writing brush to write the characters to be engraved on the wooden molds reversely. The script is the old song typeface, an official typeface used in the old times on occasions such as making notices and announcements.
So you can see an example, notices and announcements, printed here using block printing. Okay, so the printing press in the West, right? We get sort of the printing press 2.0, if you will, which is when Gutenberg comes on the scene, and he really improves the technology that already exists at that time. So we have movable type in China, but those, as you can see, they're using more wood as their material to create the stamps. Gutenberg ups the game by making metal stamps. He uses and even in Korea, they were starting to use metal also in their stamps, but the Gutenberg printing press uses an alloy metal that is even better, so he's improving upon the type of metal used to make stamps, and he's also using an oil-based ink, and he uses this stamper, which I'll show you in a minute. So basically what Gutenberg does is, he brings that movable type technology to the West, and he also makes it more efficient so that you can print more quickly and easily. And then, of course, he makes the Gutenberg Bible as one of his first books that he prints. And he also makes them in such a way where they last a long time. There's still Gutenberg Bibles that people own today. So this is bringing us closer and closer to the place where we are now, where printing is cheap and efficient, and we can own books easily. Okay, now I want to show you this short clip of this guy actually in a museum somewhere using a Gutenberg printing press.
Now I knew that if he just laid a sheet on like that and rolled it into there and did an impression, he could lay every piece on exactly the same, especially when he prints on the back. He's got to line those columns up exactly. So that's the next big problem he has to solve. What's the answer to that? Well, here it is right here. The template and the frisket.
You got a little needle that you stick the paper on.
This is called the tympan. It's just leather over a frame, which provides a place for us to put our paper on. And these little points called duckbills position it up and down. And then we have a mark here for left and right. Now watch this. This is very important. These pins poke through the paper. And when he prints on the other side, he puts the paper back on through those same holes, and that gives him something to hold the paper against the tympan. It's called.
All right, it closes the thing.
Print, and it also allows us to lift that paper back up off that sticky type without tearing it or smearing it. So now we're ready to fold the Timpani and Triscuit down over our inky type. Ready to roll the whole bed of the press underneath the platen.
Here you can see the whole
Platen
machine.
is this big flat board that's going to lower to press the paper against an ink type. Now the press has this screw device, the flat board, and the handle that turns the screw, and that's going to lower the platen and press the paper against an ink type. The person that did this was called the puller. So we're going to make an impression here. Now notice the size of the platen, it's really quite small because the
Move
bigger
it
the
over,
platen is.
you do it again.
Now we can roll it out. Need to open up the Triscuit and take our printed sheet off. And there we've printed 2 pages of the Gutenberg Bible. And it's
That's how they did it. So as you can see, it still took a long time to print anything. It was still an expensive and time-consuming process, and over the years, it gets easier and quicker. And they also had to set all the type into the little template, and that took a long time. You had to get all the little tiny letters or the little tiny words and put them just so and arrange them, and then make like hundreds of that stamp, and then move to the next page and typeset it, put all the little stamps right in the right place, and stamp that page and keep going. Here's another picture of that printing press you just saw in motion, and here's a little typeface that you have to carefully arrange. Took a long time. All right, so how does society change? How does society change as a result of the printing press? Well, this is normally where we have a really cool discussion and people guess every one of these bullet points that I'm about to show you. So first, the clergy has less authority. So just like we said, right, the religious elite can read the Bible. And what they used to do was sometimes, I'm sure there were churches and religious leaders that were totally honest and did a great job, but there were also some that took advantage. And for example, you had to pay penance for sin. This was a rule, like if you sinned, you might have to pay some money to the church in order to be forgiven. That's not in the Bible, right? But nobody could read the Bible back then. It was some people could, but it wasn't common. And a lot of times the sermons and stuff were given in Latin, which was not a common language that people spoke then. And so people were kind of in the dark about how do we get to heaven? How do we not go to that scary place called hell? So clergy had more authority. After the printing press, first thing Gutenberg starts printing is a bunch of Bibles. So now people have a reason to learn to read, and it's more common that somebody that's not a religious authority has a Bible and can read it. And we see Martin Luther right around the emergence of the printing press. Martin Luther uses the printing press in incredible ways. Some people call him the first mass marketer because he takes sermons, basically, or biblical messages, and he puts them not in Latin, and he doesn't put them in hoity-toity terms. He puts them in common, everyday, street lingo German, right? And then he prints a pamphlet. So basically, he's got this very short book or essay or sermon, and he writes it down in common vernacular, in common street German, and he prints it on one sheet of paper using the printing press, and then he folds it into a pamphlet of like 8 little tiny pages, printed on one sheet of paper, folded into a little pamphlet. So now somebody in the working class, like me, I could maybe buy a book, right? I could buy a Martin Luther pamphlet. I could read something that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise, right? Because maybe I just grew up in my small community and I went to the same church and I saw the same people, and we all think that in order to get to heaven, we have to do these certain things. And then maybe my uncle or my cousin got a hold of one of Martin Luther's pamphlets, and he says, actually, what Jesus taught is pretty different than what the church is teaching today in these ways. So let's look at this. So people hear ideas outside their tribe or outside their small community, which is something we're living in today, right? On the internet and whatnot, we are hearing all kinds of different ideas. We might have been taught one way by our parents. We might have been taught a religion and a way of thinking and a set of morals. And then we go out from the home, in school, we meet friends, we go to their houses, but we also get online, on social media, we watch movies, and we are exposed to lots of different ways of thinking about the world. Lots of different answers to the question, why are we here? What's our purpose? Who put us here? And so we have a much more difficult time now figuring out why we're here and what we're supposed to do here than people used to when they only ever heard one idea or one explanation. Okay, so what else? People begin to favor larger nation states over smaller tribes and communities. So we already pointed at this trend, but that now that you can write things down and you can disperse pamphlets across a larger geographical area, we can now have, instead of just 150 people in our community, we may belong to a nation where we may never even meet all of the people in our nation. You know, our community or our group or our borders can get much bigger now that all the big towns inside of that nation state can have a printing press and can reprint the announcements or the news or the rules or the laws or any of the updates. You know, we're going to war, or the war just ended, and how we can, you know, send people with that message to try and quickly print and reproduce the announcements so that more people can be united. And then lastly, public education and literacy gain momentum, which you probably guessed this one. More people start reading, and eventually we lay the groundwork for public education where it's standard. Everybody gets to learn to read. Okay, so what's happening in the colonies? North America, we've talked about what's happening over in England, right? We get the printing press in the mid-1400s, and slowly we start to see ideas emerging that in larger nation states, people hearing ideas outside their tribe. What is happening in North America, right? Well, in North America, people are struggling to survive, right? They're just trying to grow enough food to eat and not get a horrible disease and die. So it takes a little longer for printing to become normal and common in the colonies over here in North America. So about the mid-1600s, we start to see printing. And then we're seeing mostly government documents being printed and religious documents being printed. So printing is very much controlled in the colonies. So the British government has still got royal governors over here in the colonies, and they passed the Stamp Act in 1765, which mandates that all printing be done on paper stamped with the government's seal. So remember, we have issues over here in the colonies where we don't like being taxed all the time. We don't feel fairly represented over in Great Britain. And now they're trying to basically tax anything that we print. There's got to be a stamp, and everything that's printed needs to be approved. And so it feels like somebody is sort of doing mind control, controlling the ideas that can be dispersed. Well, the Stamp Act goes somewhat ignored in the colonies, and a lot of the more independent thinkers like Thomas Paine start to print ideas that are dissentious. They dissent from Great Britain and spread ideas advocating independence, like we see in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which sells 120,000 copies in the first 3 months. So that's a lot, right? It was very popular. So a lot of people were feeling this angst with the British presence in the colonies and were wanting more independence. And the printing press was used in the colonies to disseminate those ideas about independence, even though the government tried to put a kibosh on that. All right, so this leads us to a question that we're going to address throughout the semester, and that is, how does government control the press? Or in other words, how much say does a president have over what gets printed in the news? Because certainly, Donald Trump, for example, has a lot to say about the news outlets, particularly the news outlets that don't cover him very favorably. So what is the history of governments trying to control the press? And why do we have this amendment to our Constitution that allows for freedom of the press? Why did we do that? So we're going to talk about those questions more throughout the semester, but I want to show you this quick map that tries to make a graphic around journalistic freedoms. So which countries have more journalistic freedom? In other words, they're able to criticize the government. They're able to write ideas that would go against the powers that be. And as you can see, the countries that are white, like Norway and Sweden, have the most journalistic freedoms, as thought by Reporters Without Borders, who's probably the biggest organization looking at these things. And, the United States doing pretty well. This was in 2017, so now it's maybe not doing as well as it was then. And then we move all the way down to like the red countries that are described as a difficult situation, or China, Sudan, certainly North Korea is in there somewhere, that are a very serious situation where the government has a tight rein on what is printed in the press. Okay, so now I want to transition and talk a little about the book industry today. If you're following along in your book, this section of the lecture is reflected in the textbook pretty well in chapter 3. So there are more books than ever before being published today, which means there's more books being written and more read in the United States today than ever before, contrary to what some people might like to say that, oh, no one's reading books anymore. There's more books written and read today. Now that may be in part because of population growth, and also because publishing and book sales, those industries are changing. So as we've seen through last lecture, the media industry as a whole, we've got trends of concentration in media ownership and conglomeration, which leads to an oligopoly, or fewer and fewer media companies controlling more and more of the content. So the big media companies buying out the smaller media companies and controlling more and more of media content. And you see this reflected in the book industry through the 5 big publishing houses. So instead of there being 50 publishers, the large publishers, the big, powerful, and wealthy book publishers have bought out the smaller book publishers. And while they still may retain their names, sometimes they're ultimately controlled by one of the big publishers. Of course, there are still independent publishers out there, but as a whole, there are 5 big, powerful ones that control most of the content that gets traditionally published. But now we have the option of self-publishing online, which is pretty cool because authors that are little known have that option where they don't have to go through the traditional gatekeeper of a publisher, even though it's probably easier if you can get published with a traditional publisher to get your ideas out there, to get your book out there and get it marketed for you. There are those 5 big publishing houses, which you see here in this white box. So that's book publishing, right? Controlled by some big companies. But then you have book sales. What's happening in the book sales, like book retail sales today? Well, as you might be able to guess, more and more book sales are happening online. So the physical bookstores that you walk into and you can look around, I don't know about you, but I love to go to Barnes & Noble and peruse. The number of physical bookstores is dwindling and online sales are increasing, especially when it comes to Amazon. So if you're talking about book retailing, you got to know about Amazon because Amazon is arguably the largest book retailer in the United States. Some of the recent numbers are that they are selling 40% of all new books sold every year and controlling 60% of ebook sales. So that was a statistic, just put into your textbook. So the number changes a lot, but Amazon is still pretty much dominating the book sales industry. All right, so that should give you a little snapshot of the book industry today, and that concludes our lecture. So have a wonderful day, and as always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me. I respond as soon as I can, and I always enjoy reading your comments when you comment on the lectures. Have a good one.